Sir John Curtice is Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, the Senior Research Fellow at the National Centre of Social Research and President of the British Polling Council. He's the country's foremost psephologist and one of the best-known media commentators on elections and polls, as well as on Scottish independence. James Gurling has recently completed 4 years as chair of the Federal Campaigns and Elections Committee. He previously chaired the Campaigns and Communications Committee, as well as the party's campaigns in 2017 and the 2019 general elections. He led formal reviews of the 2014 European election campaign and the 2015 general election campaign. His other roles within the party have included the leadership election agent for Charles Kennedy and being a local councillor in Southwark. James is currently a member of the Federal Board and the Federal Conference Committee. John, I'll hand over to you for the first introduction.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you for the invitation to talk. I'm afraid those of you are hoping that because we were doing this over Zoom, you would be denied the pleasure of my slides. I'm afraid I'm about to be disappointed because what I'm now going to do is to share my screen so that you can all see what I am trying to talk about. So I thought that an obvious thing to do in the wake of this, we're now 6 months on from the election. I did give a talk at the National Liberal Club back in January, but that's a little while ago, and obviously a lot has happened in the meantime. And not least of the things that's happened in the meantime is that the party itself has undertaken and published its own report into basically what went wrong in the 2019 election from its perspective. So I thought what I would do would be to subject some of the conclusions of that report to a little bit of analysis, a little bit of evidence, because I think, to be frank, the report is sometimes relatively thin in terms of the evidence that it presents for its conclusions, as opposed to some of the clarity of the conclusions to which it comes. I'm going in particular to focus on 5 conclusions that come in the report. The first is, of course, that arguably the most crucial decision that the party made in respect to the election was to allow it to happen in the first place. It decided to acquiesce along with the SNP in the bill that was effectively a subterfuge to get around the Fixed Term Parliament Act, an act that we might remember was only put on the statute book in the first place as a condition that the party made to form a coalition with the Conservatives. So it was a pretty radical departure from its perspective. So question number 1, did the party at that point in time take what perhaps even at the time was an unreasonable risk or not? Second, and this is something that is peppered widely through the report, it's something that was the subject of controversy at the time and it clearly continues to be since, and it's the conclusion upon which I'm going to spend most time, and that is the party's decision at its conference back in September to say that it wouldn't simply want to hold another referendum on Brexit, but rather that if the party were to win an overall majority, then it would simply revoke the Article 50 notification forthwith. Third is the battle cry that was uttered early on in the campaign, at least, to say that Jo Swinson was a candidate for Prime Minister just as much as Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, and thereby, in a sense, implying that the Liberal Democrats could achieve a very, very substantial historical breakthrough, and as to just whether or not that lacked credibility or not, and certainly the report felt that it did. Fourth point made in the report is that the party's campaign was arguably simply a one-trick pony. It was simply about stop Brexit. The report itself argues that this unduly narrowed the range of appeal that the party could hope to make, and that indeed it could hope to win over those who voted leave on the basis of the party's broader policy platform and vision. And then finally, not something I'm going to get into in great detail, but really just to almost say, well, there's now have to think about where does the party go in future. Another complaint is poor constituency targeting, and I think although it's said somewhat in code, perhaps a feeling that too much money was spent on the constituencies that were being fought by the 7 recent defectors to the party, as opposed to some of the constituencies where perhaps there was a longer term evidence that the party might be able to make a significant advance. So let's go through each of these in turn. So question number 1 is, was the party frankly foolish in allowing the election to happen at all? Now, of course, it's worth bearing in mind what was in the back, I think, of the party's mind, indeed was in the back of mind of many of those on the Remain side, was that with John Bercow's decision to resign as Speaker at the end of October and his anticipated replacement by Sir Lindsay Hoyle, it was suspected that Sir Lindsay Hoyle would not be willing to interpret the standing orders of the House of Commons as liberally as John Bercow had done, and that therefore the manoeuvres that had allowed the Benn Bill to go through in September and thereby to force the extension of the Brexit deadline from October to January, that trick would not be capable of being repeated, and that therefore basically the government could just simply hang on and try to say no deal or our deal by the middle of January. So we have to remember that's the backdrop. That said, it only makes sense to call an election if you actually think there's a reasonable probability that the outcome of that election will indeed achieve your objective. And the objective here, of course, was simply to deny the Conservatives a majority. Given that the Conservatives had no friends, once the Tories were significantly below 326 seats, then basically we could reasonably anticipate that a pro-Remain government would be installed under Jeremy Corbyn. Fragile though it might be, that would be the obvious course of action. Now, what I'm showing you here is just to remind you the trajectory of support for the parties during the course of 2019 up to the eve of the decision to call the election. Now, there's some evidence in this where you would say, yep, calling the election, going for an election seems quite a reasonable proposition. That is that once the party support took off in the middle of 2019 and essentially took off once it was clear we were going to have a European Parliament election, that support for the party seemed to be very stable. It was basically running at 18% on a consistent basis all the way through from July through to October. It looked as though that this was a transformation in the party's prospects that looked relatively stable. And meanwhile, certainly there wasn't any sign of the Labour Party being able to recover from the quite serious damage that had been inflicted on it, in part by the loss of Leave voters, but also, frankly, much of the damage being done by the Democrats themselves as they competed seriously with the Labour Party for the support of Leave voters. So that would be the argument for the prosecution. The argument against, however, would be to notice what was happening on the Brexit side of the argument. The Conservatives had shown signs of recovering from the 24-25% to which they had fallen during the summer. Actually, Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister itself began to see support for the Conservatives increase. And once Boris Johnson had got a deal, a revised deal, following his talks with Leo Varadkar on the Wirral, then the Conservative position strengthened quite considerably and did so, as one can see if one looks towards the right-hand side of this graph, at the expense of the Brexit Party. And the truth is, you did not need to engage in any clever MRP analysis or anything else. You could simply take those numbers and say, well, what would happen if the implied changes in party support were to be replicated across the UK as a whole? What would happen? And the answer is Conservatives 345, and Boris Johnson is able to deliver Brexit. So I think the truth is that at the point at which the decision was made to acquiesce in the election, the argument that going for the election was an extremely risky strategy was, I think, clearly there, because even if the party were able to hang on to the 18% that it had, given the advances that the Conservatives were making, A, the dividend from that 18% could be quite minimal, but B, crucially, the opposition parties looked unlikely to be in a position, the Conservatives, to deny the Conservatives a majority, unless the Conservative vote fell back again. But betting on that was certainly quite a considerable bet. So I think to that extent, at least, probably the report is quite right, and some of us were certainly extremely surprised at the party's decision to acquiesce. And again, some of what was going on underneath this is quite clear. This is just showing you how the support of Leave voters was tracking over time during 2019. As you can see, yes, in the summer, the Conservative Party was overtaken by the Brexit Party amongst Leave voters, but by the time Boris Johnson is Prime Minister, that the Conservatives were already beginning to consolidate the Leave vote behind them and gradually to eat away at the Brexit Party vote. Meanwhile, however, on the other side of the fence, the truth is the Remain vote was divided between Labour and Liberal Democrats, and calling an election against those backdrop was essentially a bet that you would, as a party, succeed in doing so much damage to the Labour Party that you would gobble up many more Labour votes and in so doing do well enough to deny the Conservatives a majority. But that was a very long-term bet. And meanwhile, the Remain side was staring at what indeed in the end was its undoing, was the fact that its vote was split, whereas in the end, the Leave vote consolidated behind the Conservatives. Okay. Second thing, much talked about in the report, which is that the idea of saying that what we should go for is simply to revoke Article 50, and the argument was that the level of support for that was too low, and it put off. I think the central argument is that it put off certainly any prospect of Leave voters voting for the party, but also I think the argument is that there was a significant body of Remain voters who felt that such a position was undemocratic and unacceptable, and therefore they were more likely to go back to Labour, who of course by this time at least had finally come out in favour of a referendum, albeit on the basis of a deal that they would want to renegotiate it. Well, let's go through some of the evidence. Exhibit number 1 is the average of polls done by BMG during the summer and early autumn of last year, in which voters, as you can see, were given a range of options, ranging from leaving without a deal to revoking without having a referendum. Point 1 to note, and I think here I would directly challenge the portrayal of attitudes towards Brexit that is presented in the report, and that is a portrayal that says, you know, frankly, 50% of people don't care that much about Brexit, and they are the folk in the middle who could be won over. Well, just look at this graph, and I could show you graph after graph in 2019 that illustrates the fact that Britain was seriously divided by Brexit, and that the room for compromise positions on Brexit was minimal, as the Labour Party itself had already discovered. So 69% of Leave voters faced with those options, and this is before Boris Johnson's deal was available, were saying, let's just get out. You weren't going to appeal to them. And equally on the other side, 69% of Remain voters were saying, either revoke or let's have another referendum. But the truth is that Britain was polarized at this time. It was not some large group of people in the middle who could be swayed in either direction. Second point to note is that revoke was actually, according to this poll, relatively popular. Yes, Remain voters were divided, but amongst them, revoke was, according to the average of these polls, slightly the more popular option. Meanwhile, YouGov asked people, this was actually during the election itself, whether or not, first of all, whether something would be a good outcome or an acceptable compromise or a bad outcome. And then amongst the options were one, revoke and remain, and the second was have a referendum where, you know, the government would be neutral, which is in the end Corbyn's position. And the point, as you can see here, amongst Remain voters, which is what I'm looking at here, the idea of revoke and remain was certainly more likely to be regarded as a good outcome to Brexit than was the idea of a neutral referendum. Third piece of evidence, this comes from Survation, at around the time the fateful decision was made. Does the Liberal Democrat position of revoke and remain make you more or less likely to vote Liberal Democrat? Now, I'm always deeply suspicious of this kind of polling, but just simply notice that 56% of Remain voters and 43% of people who voted Labour actually said at that point in time, yeah, actually, you know what? It makes me think about the Democrats a little more seriously. So all of this raises questions about whether such a position was necessarily a losing card. Now, that said, what does seem to be true on the one piece of evidence we've got, which comes here from the Academic British Election Study, it does look to be true that cancelling the referendum became rather less popular. Election went on. Now, this is already, the first reading here is early November, and by this stage, the party support was already falling. Party support fell the moment the election was called. But as you can see on the left-hand side, support for the idea of cancelling the referendum did gradually fall away. But another perspective, this is a survey I did. These readings are done after the election, but even after the election, with a different option put next to it, remaining without a referendum, still even at this point, is rather more popular amongst Remain voters than was remaining with a referendum. But if you prefer, opinions still seem to be pretty much divided. But in the end, the crucial thing, if you're going to demonstrate that the party's revoke position lost the party's votes, what you above all should be able to do is to demonstrate that the people on the Remain side who prefer another referendum were more likely to have defected from the party than those who were in favour of revoke. And it's that it's very difficult to demonstrate. I'll do this from two surveys. This is the survey that I was running during the election campaign. I asked people, as you can see, how they would vote. The left-hand side shows you the proportion of people, first of all in the blue graph, the proportion of people who were in favour of Remain, no referendum, who said they were going to vote Liberal Democrat during the course of the election campaign. And then the orange bar is the proportion of people who were in favour of Remain, but with a referendum. Again, during the campaign. And on the right-hand side is for exactly the same group, how they actually voted. And the crucial thing to note, well, they noticed that actually the party ended up being, rather, according to these data, rather more popular amongst the folk who were in favour of a referendum. But secondly, the decline in the party's support, as measured by this poll, and much of the polling was done during the campaign itself on the left-hand side, is the same amongst both groups of Remain voters. Equally, if we take the British election study, which again, we can compare polling just done in early November with how people said they voted, but again, looking at people according to their views at the beginning of the campaign. Now here, with a slightly different set of options, The parties rather more popular amongst the folk who said, let's remain without a referendum than amongst those who with. But the crucial thing to note is that support for the party goes down and goes down by roughly the same amount amongst both groups of Remain voters. In truth, the party's problem, I think, during the election campaign, was not that revoke was necessarily a guaranteed disaster, but rather, in the end, it was rather ineffective. It was relatively ineffective in the sense that it meant that the party got to itself a group of very committed Remain voters. Whereas in contrast, if you look at the support for the Brexit party at the beginning of the campaign, it was all the no dealers. It wasn't the soft leavers, it was definitely no dealers. The party was picking up soft as well as hard Remainers, as it were, throughout the campaign. But secondly and crucially, support for the idea probably diminished during the campaign. It wasn't sold effectively, and the party lost support across the spectrum of Remain voters, irrespective of their views on the referendum vote. So to that extent, at least, I think the report has somewhat missed its target. And there's always, always a risk for any party, go into election, lose the election, this is what we did, ergo what we did must have been wrong. This does not necessarily follow, and I think the party's at risk of making that mistake in this case. Okay, much more briefly, the other points in the review's report. One is Jo Swinson ending up not really being much of an asset, and therefore her claim that she's going to become Prime Minister being not something of a disadvantage. Well, I mean, there is no truth. There's no denying the fact that Jo Swinson's popularity declined during the campaign. These were opinions, regular weekly readings, and gradually, for whatever reason, more people decided that they disapproved of her job as leader than approved. And indeed, by the time we got to the eve of polling day, actually, Jo's numbers, even amongst Remain voters, that crucial constituency of Remain voters, Jo's numbers were no better than were Jeremy Corbyn's. And indeed, even on the particular issue of Brexit, Jo, and even amongst Remain voters, Jo Swinson was only doing slightly better than Jeremy Corbyn. Here is, again, my panel. 42% of people saying they trusted Jo Swinson to make the right decisions about Brexit, 36% of Remain voters saying Jeremy Corbyn. So I think there is no denying that Jo in the end proved to be one of the less successful of party leaders. Now, leaving aside the comment, the Liberal Party, Liberal Democrats have long been heavily dependent on the charisma of their leader, giving the party a sense of momentum, giving it visibility, etc., etc. That perhaps was always a very difficult role for a very new leader to try to fulfill. And I think certainly the election at best came too early for Jo in terms of her ability to provide that kind of impetus. Party's broad vision. Now, as you already gathered, I certainly don't think, you should have seen enough numbers as went by to realise the party was fishing in the waters of Remain voters. It was not gaining ground amongst Leave voters. It never gained ground amongst Leave voters throughout the whole of 2019. So I think the idea that a broader vision would enable the party to win to Leave voters is misguided. That said, what I think a successful broader vision might have done was to give the party an ability to compete with the Labour Party for the support of Remain voters, which was the essential battle within which it was engaged in. And to give you some idea, this was some lovely polling that Lord Ashcroft did during the election campaign, in which he wasn't asking people, are you for or against the party policies, but were people able to recognise for each of the parties various policy propositions through their manifestos. And you can see how the Liberal Democrat campaign was a one-trick pony. 2/3 of the general public said, yep, we know the Liberal Democrats are in favour of revoking Article 50. But even something, well, perhaps not as controversial now, but certainly at one time would have been decidedly controversial, which was the proposal to legalise recreational use of cannabis. Only 28% of people knew that. Only 28% of people knew what, again, in the party's past, as it were in the pre-Clegg days, was a signature policy, which is increasing income tax to spend more on public services. Only around a quarter of the electorate knew about that, etc., etc. The party's broader message certainly didn't get across, whereas, well, this is now the same data for the propositions for the other parties. 51% of people are, on average, half of the public for each of the propositions about the Labour Party, half of the people knew what Labour Party was in favour of. 43% for the Conservatives, only a quarter able to identify the Liberal Democrats. Okay, finally, targeting. I'm not going to say much, just a slight word of warning. This, in the end, sums up why the 7 defectors, well as they did. Left-hand side shows, on average, the 7 defectors managed to increase their vote by just over 15%. But the right-hand side shows you why it wasn't enough, because even though they increased their vote by 15%, they were still 15% behind on average where they were fighting. In other words, they on average got halfway to where they needed to get to. And the truth is they were, in most cases, virtually all of them, of course, fighting seats with little in the way of Liberal Democrat tradition, etc., etc. They certainly were fighting a tall order. Now, you can certainly understand why somebody like Sarah Wollaston, who was fighting their own constituency, that there the choice was perhaps obvious. Some of the other choices that were made perhaps were not so obvious. That said, let us also bear in mind that the party did not do terribly well in an awful lot of places that even in the relatively recent past were represented by Liberal Democrat MPs. And I've just shown you here, these are the 10 worst performances, the 10 biggest drops in party support. Now, North Norfolk is, of course, because the Norman Lamb decided to stand down. But notice, Leeds Northwest, Southport, Ceredigion, St Austell, Birmingham Yardley, Devon North, Burnley, Eastbourne, Portsmouth South. These are all recent Liberal Democrat constituencies. And the party did lose ground quite heavily in a lot of those places where, until recently at least, there's been an awful lot of Liberal Democrat local campaigning. So Liberal Democrat local campaigning, once the seat was lost, even in areas of traditional Liberal Democrat strength, didn't necessarily fare that well either. And the truth is that one of the things the party will need to recognise, and at this point I will stop, is that Brexit has changed the geography of its support in exactly the same way as it's changed the geography of Conservative and Labour support. So the blue bars here, this is just breaking down average level support for the party in 2010, the blue bars, and in 2019, the orange bars, broken down by the level of support for Leave in 2016. So the Leaves, sorry, actually it should be, it's the wrong way around, there's level of support for Remain. So the left-hand side on the most Remain constituencies, the right-hand side on the most Leave constituencies. Yes, the party was somewhat weaker in the most pro-Leave constituencies, even in 2010, but the slope is for the most part a relatively gentle one. Now notice how much more the party's strength is concentrated in Remain Britain. Now, many of the $64,000 questions is how far that divide is going to continue, etc., etc. But certainly that the idea that the party can simply go back to the way where it was back in 2010 may not necessarily work, and that the party will certainly seem to think about what will be sensible targeting in future, given the characters of vote at present, and that, for example, regaining ground in what might be traditional Liberal territory, but is also very pro-Leave territory in places like Devon and Cornwall, might be a lot more difficult than some of the ground that the party's gained more recently in very Remainy London, or in some of the more university or very middle-class seats across the UK.
Thank you very much, John. That was a very interesting presentation, and I'm sure there are lots of questions that are going to flow from it. I'm just going to remind you or the audience to keep their cameras off and mics off. If they want to submit a question, please do so by using the chat function. I've been told that Wendy Chamberlain is now with us, so I'm going to hand over to her to carry on from now, and for James to carry on with the speaking. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Tony, and apologies to everybody for joining you all a little bit late. Unfortunately, I was required to be in the chamber, so apologies for that. Delighted to be here this evening, and thanks very much to Sir John Curtice for his introduction. For those who don't know me, I'm Wendy Chamberlain. I'm the MP for North East Fife. I overcame the most marginal of majorities back in December, and lots there obviously to think about. And I'm delighted to be here this evening because when I joined the party in 2015, my first conference, federal conference I attended, was in York in spring 2016, and the Liberal Democrat History Group was the first organisation that I joined. So delighted to be here. I know that Tony has already introduced both our speakers, so without further ado, I'll hand over to James Gurling to speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendy. And having listened to that, I certainly wish I'd spoken first. But thank you for a tour de force. I'll try as best I can not to review the review. Having done a review in 2015 myself, I know how difficult it is to draw together the level of evidence and put in that level of insight over the top of hindsight. That is, constant challenge of any reviewer. I think the first point I want to, in terms of interest for the party, is to talk about just all elections have a long tail, and we will deal with that at the end. This had quite a long neck. This is a campaign that started way back with our Stop Brexit campaign, a very poorly funded, small initiative that effectively lasted 3 leaders, but without which we wouldn't have seen the beginning of a revival in the party's fortunes at all, I would argue. Had some of the money that came to us during the course of the nearer part of the election campaign been earlier, a couple of years earlier, I think that would have made a substantial difference for us. But we have to look to some of the decisions made about the 2019 election or the 2019 environment, actually stemming from the huge local election results that we had in May of that year. That wasn't something that sort of flashed up overnight. That was something that sat alongside the Brexit campaign, and that was something that had certainly in England obviously only a familiar feel to it and caused a sense of momentum. That led us obviously on into the European elections, which Don referenced, and took us into second place, us on 20%, and Tories, interestingly enough, on sort of down around 9%. But those are key moments in the party's trajectory that took us to the stance that we had in the general election. And alongside of that, we had the creation and failure of Change UK in the same, pretty much the same ground that we had. And we had a moment there where we could have gone one way or another, and indeed our local campaigning saw us through that, and our campaigns in local councils were a bulwark against what to many in the media was the immediate death now, goodbye the Liberal Democrats. And so we had proved some resilience. We had taken hold of one particular topic, and as the graphs that John showed us just a moment ago indicates, Brexit was by far and away the greatest single issue that became to be understood as to where the Liberal Democrats were. And you probably have to, although I don't have the data at hand, but you have to go back to something as significant a political event as our position on the Iraq War before you get to the levels of recognition in a party policy belonging to the Liberal Democrats as our opposition to Brexit. So that is framing some of this. We had a series of, again, 8 MP defections from, you know, some via the Change UK intermediary, others direct. We went into the summer, or the party conference, with a new dynamic, different face in British politics as our party leader, with a substantial mandate to do things. So in large respects, the party was in a better position than it had, and because of the defections, that leader took a more representative parliamentary party than the Liberal Democrats had ever had before into that election. Those are substantial elements that we experienced in the September conference, and all, I think, go along to helping to explain the first conundrum that John asked us to face in terms of that decision to call the election when it took place. Now, it feels to me like that this was very much an element of, I'm not going to put the blame on Westminster bubble, but it was a Westminster bubble decision. The importance of the change in speaker, was very, very important in terms of Westminster considerations, but utterly not understood by the rest of the country, who had begun to get a sense of this. We'd had over the summer also, and I want to speak a little bit more about this in detail, the impact of the Brecon and Radnor by-election that again showed the continued level of momentum that we had, and that the moment in our position on Brexit was achieving what appeared to us to be cut through, and was certainly being repeated to us on the ground. John also cautioned against reliance on MRP for targeting basis, but it's undeniable that if you looked at that level of MRP, there were seats that were therefore coming into play in areas where the electorate was seemingly making a decision about us that was actually devoid of any local campaigning capabilities. So when you're in a situation where you're looking at 200 seats meaningfully, statistically in play, but also knowing that there were only 16 seats against 2017, where we were nearer than 20% behind. So based on the election 2 years beforehand, we were dealing with a very much more constrained capability and a very much greater opportunity. And I guess the opportunity that we saw was being presented to us was on the issue of Brexit, where we were making the greatest cut through. I think the decision, I'm afraid, to take the election where it was, as I say, took some of these factors into consideration that were not common knowledge, and not if you like, you weren't going to speak about this in the pubs, clubs and societies up and down the country. And it certainly felt a little bit to me as it being something that was born out of a response and a reaction to parliamentary tactics than it was to the mood in the country, and certainly to campaigners. And again, I might come back to this, but as John pointed out, although we had a leader with a very strong mandate, we had a leader that was exceedingly unknown more generally in the population. And I think that does explain some of the promotional aspects that we sought to try and do and achieve in a very, very short time. And with more time to introduce Jo to the electorate, I think there would arguably have been a better idea, a better understanding of who she was, where her level of optimism was, and where the level of confidence that people could have in her. But she came to the electorate as an unknown quantity, and we took a decision, rightly or wrongly, to use this as a means to introduce her. The first PEB, effectively, of the campaign was an introduction to the leader, trying to familiarise people with her just visually was a major activity that I thought was a genuine function for the campaign. But it is also true that things were shifting even as we were making these decisions. The revoke Article 50 decision wasn't something that was a strategic decision necessarily by the party. It is criticised in the review, but this was something that we did in full public vision. This wasn't a surprise to anybody. This was done in slow motion. It was a motion. There are some lessons for us that I think we have to bear in mind as a party. And if you're going to make a major strategic decision via a change of party policy, then testing in advance how to communicate that change in party policy might be a useful thing to do. But as John said, for our core audience, it seemed again to be a sustainable and sensible area, bearing in mind the feedback that we were having from it. It rarely formed a part of our active campaign literature, and it was something that was clearly opened as a weakness and reported back to us as being a weakness. And it was very clear that this was something that we could stop saying, but I don't think that would have made a huge amount of difference, because it was being said about us, and it was clearly concerning some people more than others. The point about targeting, again, that we talked about, bearing in mind our capabilities, our campaigning capabilities, I think is also worth bearing in mind. We divided that up internally, democratically, by the Federal Communications and Elections Committee into a series of 40, 40 and 80 plus seats, because it seemed to us at the time that there was a need to build capacity, but also in some areas the capacity had already been predetermined by the electorate, and that in retrospect is something that we can't afford to do, and that had I been talking to you, having brought the campaign having brought in an additional 20 seats, people would still be upset, but they wouldn't be as upset as we have been. So the big things that were happening along this line are Labour's utterly unclear policy on Brexit gradually shifting over time, us in a determined attempt to polarise the debate. We had registered Stop Brexit, Liberal Democrats to Stop Brexit as one of our ballot paper descriptors. Our eggs were in the Brexit basket by strategy. It was deliberate. It was, I think, an honourable position, and it was very clear. Indeed, the clarity and the polarisation might have been what drew the decision that drove the December election as a Westminster capability. But in the end, a very small amount of a far smaller amount of that Remain vote stayed with us, and clearly strategy such as that was failed, and it led to the disappointment that the title of this the discussion seeks to address. We did this, as John said, arguably it was done because we didn't want to allow a no-deal Brexit to come. Our sole job was to try and stop Brexit and to throw as much into the tanks of the Stop Brexit position as we possibly could. And that was not a strategy that failed. Sorry, it was a strategy that failed. And clearly the lack of cut through on other subjects actually also shows a distinctive relationship to the policies that had come through in 2017 and some of the ones that have been most criticised of us, such as decriminalisation of cannabis. So why did it happen? Well, obviously, John has also stepped out how effectively Labour voters slunk back to stop Boris rather than stop Brexit. We did spectacularly badly, despite Corbyn, despite the lack of clarity, I would argue, on Brexit, and despite the anti-Semitism problems. There were seats such as St Albans, City of London, Esher, Wimbledon, Cambridge South, where there was a substantially successful or a more successful Labour squeeze, obviously more so in St Albans, but that was insufficiently capable of bucking the trend. And I think there is a close correlation in that between the identified dip in popularity for Jo throughout the campaign. And the other thing that I think was raised was that John raised was the claim to be Prime Minister. And it's right, that caused some problems. I think it was something that was candidate for Prime Minister was something that was tried and tested in an internal audience. And the difficulty that it gave to the party in terms of communication was it took you straight over the top of the longer standing, more embedded commitment to a second referendum. It went straight to, if you're going to be the candidate for Prime Minister, it means you have a majority, and if you've got a majority, you are going to revoke. And the referendum part of that no longer formed part of the narrative that we were being offered. Of course, part of the reason for that was we were simultaneously fighting very hard in the early stages of the campaign to ensure that the leaders' debate was a three-way debate. We felt it very unfair that the broadcasters were offering effectively two Leave leaders without there being a consistent and very clear pro-Remain leader as part of that debate. And we took legal action with ITV in the first instance, and part of that was we have a right to be there, and a conclusion from that was yes, we have a right because it is possible, if the electorate so choose it, that Jo could be a Prime Minister. Obviously, as soon as that finished, that needed to drop, and perhaps that didn't drop quickly enough, and arguably even by then that was an accusation that stuck with us. It's got to be said though that I would have to personally, I was quite surprised by the level of and strength of personal comments that came through in feedback from our opponents, indeed some of our allies, on ridiculous things that people focused on, in my view. How Jo looked, whether Jo had geometric or earrings, etc. These seem to rile a lot of people far more than is probably good for a political discourse. And I think part and parcel of people looking for reasons that they could make decisions on wider political issues that they might not otherwise have wanted to. So I think hopefully I've dealt with the one-trick pony on Brexit and revoke, and the issue of calling an election. Defectors, I think, is the final point, John, that you raised, and indeed that is a really difficult issue for a party like ours. We were very fortunate, as I said, in the parliamentary team that was assembled with Jo. Finding homes for those defectors was extremely difficult, and you would expect some loyalty to those people who have moved across, just as you would expect loyalty to our candidates, and that was a very difficult thing to manage as a party. I think there are some mitigating, in some form of mitigation. The social, the representative change that those defectors particularly brought to the composition of our parliamentary party was very, very important. It made it much more, for the first time in a long time, far easier to appeal credibly in some of the BAME audiences, BAME media that had previously not so much excluded us, but hadn't seen a reason to engage with us. And that was a major beneficiary and a major factor. But ultimately, candidates alone, leaders alone, weren't able to stop that move away from us that was evident within that Remain vote as the campaign went on. And we have to look at, I think, and indeed the review identifies this, at the way that we interpret and use data. And there's some clear things that we need to learn for the way in which we continue to use data analysis in the future. I think the point that again comes up from this is longer term, earlier funded, clearly identified campaigns are what is going to make a difference. And we will not have the luxury, if it was a luxury, in any future election of having such a clearly polarized area. We are going to need to fight it on a range of progressive and centre-left policies, and we are going to need to deal with the issue that will still be thrown back at us, I'm sure, in 5 years' time, that will be are still our records in coalition. It still was used by Labour to shore up some of their votes, and I think we do need a narrative that takes us through that, albeit in 5 years' time. I hope that isn't as prevalent as it certainly was in 2019. And Wendy, I see your. I think you're giving me the evil eye. So I will draw my comments to a conclusion, and I'm sure I'll be tested in far greater detail by the questions you've got coming in.
Thank you very much, James. I would never give you the evil eye. Thank you very much for that, and thanks to both our speakers. So before we move on to the Q&A, and thanks to those who've already submitted questions, I'm going to hand over to Duncan Brack just to say a few words about the Liberal History Group.
Thank you very much, Wendy. I just want to introduce the group to those of our viewers who are not familiar with us. We were founded back when this party was established in 1988, and the idea of helping people understand where we came from, looking at the rich history of British political liberalism in the UK and the rather shorter history, of course, of the Social Democratic Party. And we do that in four main ways. First, we organise meetings like this one. Like everybody else, we've gone online now for the duration of the pandemic. We hope to be back to real-world meetings soon. But our next meeting will be during the party's online conference in September, and we'll be looking at the 1945 election and the legacy of Liberal-inspired social reforms, the Beveridge Report and so on, for the welfare state that was built after the election. We published the Quarterly Journal of Liberal History. The latest issue was out a couple of months ago, so we've got another one due out just in a few weeks' time. Among other things, we'll be including pieces from the two leadership candidates, Ed Davey and Layla Moran, on their favourite historical heroes. We've done that for every leadership election since the second one that the party had. And we also collaborated with Party HQ to invite the two candidates to speak about their historical heroes and to answer questions in an online history hustings. And that's actually been recorded. That's the first time this ever happened. It's been recorded and it will be showed a bit later during the leadership campaign. We'll let people know the date of that via our website, and of course it'll be on the party's website. We publish a range of reference books on liberal history, including one called Peace, Reform and Liberation, History of Liberal Politics in Britain since 1679. And we also publish a range of shorter booklets. There's an introductory history of the party for those who want a really easy kind of start, and then booklets on the history of liberal ideas and liberal thinkers and famous women liberals. And then finally, we provide a range of research resources at our website, and you can see the address of that on the virtual background behind me. So do have a look at our website, do get in touch if you'd like to talk about anything, and we hope to see you at future meetings. And just for this meeting, I see we've got plenty of questions coming in via the chat function in Zoom, so keep them coming, and I'll hand back to Wendy. Thanks very much.
Lovely, thank you, Duncan. And yes, agreed, we've already got a good selection of questions coming in. So we've got now till 8 o'clock, so we'll try and get through as many of them as possible. So I'm going to start with two questions. The first one primarily to John, and then a second question primarily to James. So the first question, John, to yourself is from Mark Pack. It says, your evidence points strongly towards the revoke policy not being a significant vote loser for the party. Yet many Lib Dems who were out canvassing regularly during the campaign are convinced it was based on what people said on the doorstep, that it was a factor. And certainly my own experience, it was raised. So how do you, and I would argue, how do we as the party reconcile those two perspectives? And the second question to James, to give him a wee bit of time to think. Surely the revoke decision was taken in response to the Labour policy change and therefore was reactive and the opposite of strategic, and just your thoughts on that. I'll hand over to John in the first instance.
Yeah, I perfectly understand that this is the feedback the party got in the campaign. I make a number of points. One, of course, as I've already demonstrated, it was the only policy that most people knew anything about. The second, therefore, was if when harangued by a Liberal Democrat canvasser as to how they're going to vote, and people wish to say, well, I'm not think I'm going to vote for you, what are they going to say? We don't like what you're going to say about Article 50, because it's the only thing they know about you. I would certainly argue that the party, and I'm not existing what I was saying, that I don't think the party succeeded in selling its position very effectively. It clearly did get itself on the defensive. It did struggle. And I guess in the end, I would say that if, once you, no, I'll be frank, I have said everything I've said, despite the fact that if you had asked me at the end of August of last year, would that be a sensible position for the party, I would have said probably not. So I am going with the evidence rather than my preconceptions. But that once you made that decision, you need to be careful. And I guess you would, the simplest argument would have been, well, look, if Boris gets a majority, he's taking us out, and if we get a majority, we're keeping us in. What's the difference? Now, okay, I know then you can come to other arguments, all right, but there is the simple argument, which is to say, look, we're against Brexit, we think it's a bad idea, and you would have to be willing to argue the case, all right? But the truth is you did get all defensive and you're kind of saying, well, we're not against referendums and we'll go down that route if we can, et cetera, et cetera. No, I mean, at that point, once you decided to make that decision, then I think you needed to sell that position very clearly and openly and to say, look, we are the one vote that guarantees we won't leave the European Union, right? Well, we could argue about the SNP in Scotland, but we'll leave that to one side, right? In England and Wales, at least, we are the only vote that you can take to go down that path, because the Labour Party's position at the end of the day was Jeremy Corbyn is neutral on Brexit. So, to be honest, what you needed to do was to say, Boris wants to get us out. Jeremy doesn't know what the hell he's going to do. We are clear, we want to stop it. End of story. But you weren't. You were too defensive, I think, and you weren't therefore able to portray and convey the policy position effectively.
Very much. So we maybe explained it too much in some respects. Yeah. James, over to you in terms of your question, but if you've got any observations on that, please feel free to contribute.
Yeah, no, I share. I shared then John's frustration. We did have a very clear message, and it had worked extremely well at the European elections with no complications. And it was F***CK Brexit or Stop Brexit, whichever version of the manifesto you wanted to hold up. I think the obviously it was bollocks to Brexit, but I mean, kind of clearly people understood that. We slightly overcomplicated our message with revoke, and I think the ask. Sorry, I didn't catch who had asked the point about the revoke being reactive rather than strategic. I don't think. I mean, in many ways, it was neither. The revoke decision was one that was tabled through Federal Conference Committee in June or July after the European elections. It was born out of perhaps an internal argument about whether or not we should be the if we leave, we will return. It was an answer to that argument rather than anything else. And revoke seemed at that stage to be simply another way of stopping Brexit. And so I think, whilst it was a little controversial at the conference, it was clearly voted on by a large number of people. And I think the element of whether or not it was therefore anybody else's decision to include it or not in the manifesto, I think it would have been a very, very brave campaign chair who said, you know what, this is just complicating things a little bit. This thing that we've just voted on at our own federal conference by an overwhelming margin, we're going to take out of our manifesto. And I think that would have been, that would have guaranteed an unseemly internal row, and I think would have been at that stage entirely unnecessary. So it was kind of possibly neither one thing nor another, but in the terms of the overall narrative, as John says, it was simply part of the stop Brexit proposal that we were offering to the electorate, and we, friendly fire internally caused us to start talking about whether or not we were still committed to the referendum. And I think there's one last thing, Wendy, I want to say that I certainly experienced this, but a lot of members wound up by some of the other Remain pressure groups was on the receiving end of a lot of very, very irate people that we had walked away from our commitment to the referendum. So you had at one element, a bunch of people being very, very worried about the referendum and why we weren't sticking to it, with another people just basically despairing, do whatever you can to stop Brexit. And we worried about the internal fire rather than, and I think that came across in some of it. Final thing, actually, Jo did stick with Stop Brexit and was perceived, therefore, in media terms as being quite intransigent on it. And I don't think that necessarily did her any favours in terms of sticking to her guns. But as I say, a narrative which takes you from candidate for Prime Minister to being a majority government omits the notion of a referendum. And that was something I think people needed on our side internally to hear more of.
And that reflects, I suppose, what John was saying in his presentation about the fact that the Remain aspects fractured and the Leave didn't, which would help deliver the majority. John, are you wanting to come in there before I move on to the next question?
No, just move on. It's good. Get some more
questions.
Okay,
lovely. Thank you very much. So the next question is to both of you. It's from Robert Brown, which is, why ultimately did people move away from us during the election with such unappealing competitors, arguably, when in many previous elections we had gained credibility and vote share during the election campaign?
Robert's supposition's correct. Usually Liberal Democrats stroke Liberals gain ground during elections. I think I would run the argument as follows. So essentially, I mean, the party did have two targets. One target was the Conservative Remain vote, and the other target was the Labour Remain vote. It was the battle with Labour that, for the most part, was lost during the campaign. And I think the crucial thing to understand here was that in the European, by the way, I think the party seriously overestimated its performance in the English local elections. The party performance in the English local elections was still well below the norm before the coalition, and everybody forgot that the baseline that was being defended was the 2015 local elections, which was the worst set of local election results ever, right? It was the European Parliament election that was good, but in the European Parliament election, what happened, particularly on the Labour side, is an awful lot of people who frankly had probably voted Labour all their lives, and some of whom were well-known public figures, voted for the Liberal Democrats. And the party therefore needed to keep them on side. And I think on the one hand, the fact that eventually Starmer and Thornbury pushed the Labour Party into a clearer pro-referendum decision did make more difficult. So however, whether we regard what the Democrats did as reaction or not, I think certainly that made it more difficult for the party. And secondly, this is why I think the lack of a wider appeal mattered. So where were the other things that the party was saying that might say to somebody who usually votes Labour, well, actually, you know what, these folk on the domestic agenda are not bad either. So therefore gives them a reason other than Brexit for sticking with the party. So that's why I think the weakness of the party's domestic agenda kicks in, because, these folk were soon going to be appealed to again by a fairly strong left-wing Labour message. The party needed to keep them in with more than remain. And I think, that was what was missing. And once we got into a tribal election campaign, that became much more important.
Thank you. And over to James.
Yeah, I think, look, it is undeniable that as the Labour vote, the Labour Remain vote that we had amassed and over time had delivered us that success that we'd had to that point, I think they became, they reacted to what they saw happening in the polls. They didn't see a bandwagon taking off that was going to provide a safe home for them. They wanted to stop Boris more than they wanted, arguably, I think, to stop Brexit. I think there are a number of other underlying causes which we need to learn from. In that, I don't know how much the panoply of different policy options in our manifesto and ours engages with the electorate. It's certainly true that a wider range of policy recognition allows you a greater level of accessibility. But I think with that failure to retain those Labour votes, a lot of that has to be seen in some of the core, some of the inner city urban areas where Labour voters were coming across, and they were possibly, not as wholly aligned on Brexit as they most. And I think we failed to bring those that variety of communities across I spoke, and I think that is one of the factors that a changed parliamentary party, it was hoped of itself would increase our appeal. So I think those are some of the factors that explain why people, why we didn't gain more. But I think we had an extraordinarily polarized election, and if you really didn't want to take the risk with Jeremy Corbyn, you thought there was a possibility of certainty, you would have voted in larger amounts than perhaps otherwise you might have done. And I think there's a story here that we have only scraped the top of, and that is the impact of a polarized election campaign with a very, very left-wing leader of the Labour Party, and an equally uncertain right-wing leader. And there was an assumption that we should have been garnering all those votes in the middle, and yet we didn't have the spread of engagement to retain that and attract that vestigial audience. It is not a problem that we are going to have, I suspect, in future elections with certainly with the leader of the Labour Party that we have at the moment, and the trajectory of overall politics. John, I saw you despairing at me then. Was that a...
Well, I would question the proposition that Boris Johnson is right-wing. One of the crucial things about Boris Johnson, I think I would argue that, even before coronavirus, this government marked the end of neoliberal government in the UK, because he on economic issues, he's very interventionist. Yeah, sure. He's able to articulate the socially conservative vision of Brexit, but the crucial thing to realise, Brexit is not a left-right issue. People on the left in politics were as likely to vote for Brexit as were people on the right. It cut across the traditional left-right divide, which was why it was such a difficult issue for Tory and Labour, and why it played to your strengths, because the Liberal Democrat vote is never strongly demarcated on the left-right spectrum. It always does well amongst social liberals. Opposing Brexit was a social liberal issue. It was a homemade issue for you. But Boris is a mixture of economically interventionist, actually very centrist by conservative standards, with yes, an ability to articulate the socially conservative message, which is arguably one of the reasons why he was able to win over Leave voters from the Labour Party, because he was speaking an economic message that appealed to them, while certainly also articulating their views about the European Union.
Well, he's certainly outlefting the Labour Party at the moment in terms of state control of the economy. So,
yeah, sure.
You know, I mean,
but you know, as has been pointing out, quite a lot of what Rishi Sunak has announced today was in the Conservative Party manifesto in 2019. All right, this was a party that was already promising to intervene significantly in the economy in a way that did not happen under Thatcher or happen under Major.
So I suppose the supplementary question from me, gents, then is if left-right was less important in this election, will open-closed continue to be as important as the issue with Brexit receipts?
Wendy, that's the $64,000 question, right, to which we don't know. All we can tell you so far is that in the wake of coronavirus, the divide has not disappeared. It's still there, it's just as strong, but that you can still get movements on both sides of the divide. So basically what's happened in England and Wales is that support for the Conservatives has gone down amongst both Remainers and amongst Leavers. It's across the board. And in Scotland, support for the SNP for independence has gone up amongst Remainers and across Leavers. So again, a crucial thing to realise is that the structure of an electorate doesn't always explain the dynamics. Dynamics can occur on top of a fixed structure. Indeed, it often does, right? So it may be still that the electorate is structured by Brexit, but that you can still get dynamics. But of course, you know, it depends on what are the issues that we are talking about and the appeal of the parties in what may be no more than 2024. You know, if we're still arguing about immigration, if we're still arguing about Europe in 2024, then Brexit's still going to matter. If, on the other hand, we're arguing about inequality, then sure, the agenda would have moved on.
James, any thought on that before I move on?
I don't. I mean, I think that's a perfectly fair observation, and I would say that that's dealing with that is going to be Lisa Smart's bag if she's on the. I don't know if she's on the.
Absolutely, and I suppose, you know, a different potentially constitutional question and divide in Scotland as
Absolutely.
we move on. So moving on, I'll take this question to James in the first instance. This is from Keith Orrell in York, and it's more an observation which I'm going to turn into a question, which was, we had more money nationally than in any previous general election, but that appeared to be spent in a target seat on regular target mailing that said the same thing each time and potentially became a negative. Was this is the way of shaping it, was this a missed opportunity to detail our policies?
I think however much, money that you get, the earlier you get it, the better that you can use it. And I think in the context of when that money came in and the resource that we had, I mean, we were still trying to hire up, into the campaign, field staff that were going to be new and fresh, and be able to give us that campaigning capacity. And that's the sort of thing that you can do with high levels of donation. And I think the only similar level of quantifiable change that we'd had from money donated was in Charles Kennedy's campaign. And you remember the poster campaign that was, we propose, we oppose. That poster campaign that used a well-known face but kind of made some very simple statements that went down well. But we did that because there's almost nothing else that you could do with a large influx of money at that time. Yes, obviously lots of feedback about targeted mail. Perhaps we do clearly need to be able to do it in a different way. But many of the problems that arose were in terms of time lag. It is the time that it takes to design and produce a leaflet, get it through into the distribution system, and causes all sorts of conflicts, perhaps locally, in terms of when it drops, and the appearance of when it drops, and then also with the campaign moving on. Now, the only other way around doing it is to do things more spontaneously, do things more expensively, and that might have its own impact of reducing the number of mailings that you would get, simply because your costs are being invested in speed rather than in frequency or quantity.
Absolutely, and I have to say I'm nodding there, because I certainly knocked doors where I was trying to give a card where they had received 2 items of mail that day, so it was definitely challenging in terms of the lag. John, any observations on that before I move on?
No, I think I won't try to cry over internal spilt milk.
Okay.
There's plenty of that.
Thank you very much. Okay, a question for both of you from Roger Crouch, which is, to what extent did perceptions of the Liberal Democrats' involvement in the coalition of 2010 to 2015 and Jo Swinson's own involvement as a junior minister account for the disappointment of 2019? And there's also another question from Joy Rosenstyle in relation to this, which is about the impacts of austerity and taking the blame. So, as you know, what impact has the coalition and Jo's role in it had on us?
Yeah, you're quite right, and that's something I should have referred to in responding to an earlier question about why the party didn't advance during the campaign. One of the ironies of the election campaign was the Democrats were being asked to defend the record of the coalition in a way that the Conservative Party was not. Now, that, of course, is because Boris Johnson had nothing to do with the coalition, and had very clearly distanced himself not only from his predecessor, but also was known not necessarily to be great buddies with his predecessor, but one. And I think, again, trying to understand why the party couldn't hang on to Labour voters, that was potentially a crucial narrative, is being able to say, look, you know, these are the folk who promoted austerity, they were in bed with the Tories, etc., etc. And now, whether the party could have done anything about it, you know, is another matter, I suppose, because, you know, if Sir Ed Davey had become leader, well, I mean, he was cabinet minister in the coalition. So, you know, whether or not the party could have been better prepared for it, I mean, who knows? But I think certainly that, you know, it's no secret that the coalition was a bit of a disaster for the party for a whole variety of reasons, of which tuition fees is the main element. But yes, I think the coalition, you know, was a problem. And I guess what will now be true is I think the coalition will be forgotten in 2024. So that's probably one thing you can stop worrying about. But yeah, I think that was an important issue for people. But, you know, again, you know, if the party had been rather, I mean, I suppose, you know, I've forgotten now, but I mean, the party basically, the only way it could really deal was to say, look, you know, there is no way that we're going to allow the Tories to remain in office. There is no chance of any kind of deal between us and the Tories this time around. Whatever we thought was right or wrong in 2010, we are very clear that it's wrong to put the Tories in power now. But of course, that then opens the whole door to, but hang on, that therefore means you're going to keep trying. I mean, you know, frankly, for most, it was a complete and utter open secret that what would happen if Boris didn't get a majority is that Corbyn would be put in. And I think, you know, therefore kind of saying that, you know, we don't want Corbyn to be Prime Minister. Again, that probably was on. So if you wanted to distance yourself from that, you probably needed to tap. But of course, I know the argument on the other side was, yeah, but we want to get a hold of those Conservative Remainers, and therefore, you know, et cetera, many of whom probably did agree with the austerity policy. So you were caught, but yeah, I think it was an issue, and I'm not sure whether or not it could have been dealt with, but certainly you should have been ready for it.
James?
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, I think the coalition experience has been something that has, you know, effectively dogged the party. I mean, it hollowed the party out between 2010 and 2015, and we lived the consequences immediately after that. It was a factor in the 17 election, despite the fact of Tim Farron not having been part of it, it was undoubtedly a factor in the ease with which Labour voters could be peeled back. I don't know if it was a corresponding element in explaining why so many Conservative Remainers actually did stay with us, and they were far more sticky than the Labour Remainers that came to us. It is a factor. I think the issue about Jeremy Corbyn, if I can put it bluntly, was rather more to do with the anti-Semitism that was rife in his Labour Party, in which he was actively arguably supporting, and I think that's that made him an altogether different form of unpalatable prospect, and something that we had to be very clear about in that regard. And I understand that that then has an equal and opposite impact in terms of forcing you to be effectively nudging that, and winking that you might do something with the Conservatives, and that opens up the whole fear of the a return to coalition. So I understand that those logics could be brought, and as I say, I think by the time we have come to 4 years' time, that the impact of that will be hopefully less, but it will undoubtedly be thrown against us. Whether or not it's thrown against the individual for being part of that, or being part of a party that has that as part of the historic record, and perhaps that's one of the things that future Liberal Democrat history groups of the future will be looking back on to see how the long-term impact on Liberal Democrat history that the coalition period has had.
Yeah, but I think there is probably will be a question we will face in 2024. Is it equidistance, or is it the Ashdown strategy of saying we'll work with the Labour Party? That is almost undoubtedly a strategic decision that the party will have to make. And I suspect that the Ashdown position is going to be the more credible position in 2024.
I completely agree, and I think that will undoubtedly clear the air, and that will be something we're back into the. Again, it's history, but it's we're probably nearer to 92 than we are to 97, admittedly, but nonetheless, that does seem to be the way in which politics is going to be shaping up.
I'd agree, certainly it's a huge impact. I suppose one of the few positives out of that impact is the fact that, that the start of our increase in membership after 2015 started with our disappointment with the coalition, and indeed I joined on the 10th of May 2015, so you can judge whether that's a good or bad thing that came out of it.
Very good thing.
So Wendy, you're the wreckage from the shipwreck, are you?
Yeah, something like that, thank you. So just conscious that we're getting into the last 10 minutes, next question from Graham Neal. Could we please speak about the level of support we received amongst Black and ethnic minority communities and lower income groups? Are we now simply a white graduate party? And I'll hand that to James in the first instance.
I think that's part of the concern that you raised, Graham, was what I was trying to address by the nature of the changed parliamentary party that we actually went into that election with, and the substantive change it made to the way in which we looked, and to the audiences that we could appeal and justifiably communicate with. And I think that was a major change. And I think now there's a smaller parliamentary party, again, not in any way like the shape of previous parliamentary parties, but we don't have that level of like BAME voice that we might have done. And I think when you look at the Remain areas that voted for us, I'm afraid, yes, they do comply demographically with precisely the sort of person that you are talking about. That doesn't mean to define us though as a party, but we have to be extremely careful at all points to ensure that the appeal that we have continues to represent those groups. As I say, I think it had a massive impact in inner city urban areas, and those votes that had traditionally been stalwart Labour voters that came to us and then went back to us in arguably smaller quantity at the last moment. And I think that's a survival issue. I think it is something that we pick up increasingly at a local government level. It's not the party that we want to be. We want to be representative, clearly, of all the communities that we do currently represent and of the society that we want to build. That is and remains a major challenge for the party, and I don't think there's any complacency in the issue that you raise.
The issue of being able to appeal to BAME voters is something that the review talks about a great deal. And it's certainly going to be true that if you're hoping to do well in London, then you've got to do well amongst the BME community. I opted not to particularly go into that further because I suspect the report is largely right, because the truth is the Labour Party has a long-standing historical association with voters in the BME community, particularly the Afro-Caribbean community, and it's one that persists even as parts of that community have moved up the occupational ladder. But maybe let me talk about the other bit, which is the graduate bit. There is no doubt that because Remain is much more popular amongst graduates than non-graduates, that the Liberal Democrats are now do have a very clear skew to their support. And indeed, let me leave you with one uncomfortable observation, which is that for a long time, the Liberal Party and the Democrats were able to say, we are the non-class party of British politics, and for the most part, although its support tended to be somewhat higher amongst middle-class voters than working-class voters, it was a not unreasonable characterisation, and certainly not unreasonable as compared to the middle-class skew of Conservative support and the working-class skew of Labour support. At the moment, at least, however, the party whose vote is most clearly structured by occupational class, and that's really a surrogate for educational background, is the Liberal Democrats, whereas neither Labour nor the Conservative Party's vote is now strongly differentiated by occupational class. So you certainly need, I mean, that's the part, again, what I was trying to say at the end, you need to be aware that Brexit has changed the demography and the geography of party support. And the fact that we're being chaired this evening by the MP for St Andrews University is indeed emblematic of a wider truth about the character of Liberal Democrat support in the wake of the 2019 election.
Absolutely. Interestingly, what's your thought on the SNP? Because in some ways they have, in some ways, traditionally replaced the working class Labour vote, as it were, in many parts of Scotland. Still with us, John?
The SNP vote isn't anything like a strong. It has also got restructured by Brexit. It's much more of a Remain vote than it was before 2016. In my view, the reason why the SNP lost ground in 2017 was very little to do with India Ref2 and everything to do with the fact that it lost its Leave support. But that said, so basically your problem in north of the border is that with the exception of one or two places like St Andrews University, the SNP gobbled up the Remain vote. They've got over 50% of the Remain vote. They are the only party, however, that with a very strong support amongst Remain voters are able to pick up more than a modicum of Leave voters. They got about a quarter of the Leave vote last time. So they're able to bring that coalition together, and that does therefore mean that, yes, it's much more of a demographically widespread vote than the Democrat voters at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you. So just one very last quick question that we'll squeeze in just quickly, which is, did the Unite to Remain pacts with Greens and Plaid make any difference? Do you think the party should stick with this approach in the future? Or, and dare I say, my experience was, I benefited from a tactical vote, but with no formal tactical agreement in place. So I'll hand that to James and then John to close. Thank you.
Did it make a difference? Probably, when you look back at it, the statistical evidence for it is very slight. Did it make a difference to me? Yes, it and other directors and campaigns. Yes, it absorbed huge quantities of time negotiating with people such as the Green Party, trying to tell them they had absolutely no chance in so many seats and receiving just blank faces. it did have an impact in Brecon and Radnor in that by-election. I'm sure John's about to tell me that this is not true, but without which a victory in that seat for us would have been all but impossible to have achieved. Do I think it's the sort of thing that we should do? Yes, I do. I think it is something that is that progressive politics is about, and that on an issue like Europe, you would have expected to have happened. It was, after all, and again, I'm sure John will tell me that I'm wrong. It was one of the largest electoral pacts agreed in the modern era. In modern era, it was not as effective for us as the Brexit decision for the Conservatives was. But it is something that we need to draw the Labour Party into very clearly if it's the sort of thing that is going to work, because they were they were kind of, Banquo's ghost, is that probably, I mean, they could have been around the table and they weren't, and with their absence or their participation, that could have been all the stronger.
Thank you. And John, to close, thank you.
Yeah, it's one of the issues that I and some colleagues and I are doing some academic work on. The conservative results election have been working on, and our provisional conclusion is as follows, is that the Unite to Remain Pact did actually help the Liberal Democrats, where the Democrats were the beneficiaries, because it looks as though the willingness of Labour Remain voters to switch to the Democrats was somewhat greater in those seats, though in the end, it wasn't enough to make a difference. On the other hand, the Liberal Democrats standing down in preference to the Greens and Plaid, neither Green nor Plaid were able to inherit the Liberal Democrat vote that you would otherwise have expected, and also indeed that the willingness of conservatives who were willing to switch to Liberal Democrats were not necessarily willing to switch to the Greens or to Plaid. So mixed fortunes, and certainly in the end wasn't able to deliver a great deal in terms of seats. It may have delivered a little bit in terms of vote for the Democrats, but only at the cost of arguably weakening the position of the Remain side in other constituencies.
Thank you very much, John. So interesting to see that academic research when it comes out. So we're just after 8 o'clock. Unfortunately, not got time for any more questions, but thank you to everybody who submitted them. And other than that, look forward to seeing those of you who are attending our virtual conference in September. And thank you very much both to Professor Sir John Curtice and James Gurling for their time this evening. Thank you.